So at the beginning of this year, Elon Musk's company Neuralink found a recipient for their brain chip. This is Nolan Arbaugh, someone who became paralyzed in 2016. He was swimming with his friends. He hit his head or his neck on something. He became, unfortunately, paralyzed. At the beginning of this year, Nolan submitted himself to be a recipient of Neuralink's brain chip. What this brain chip does is it converts the electrical signals that are given off when someone thinks something into mechanical motion. Obviously, the point here is to reestablish some of that motor control that was lost in paralyzed individuals. So this is a chip that is embedded on the surface of the brain. It has a number of electrodes. It picks up on the electrical signals that are given off when someone thinks a certain thought. So if I'm thinking about reaching out for a cup and bringing that cup to my mouth to drink water, just thinking about that will give off a characteristic signal. These brain chips are supposed to pick up on those signals and then convert it into that actual action, whether that was operating, some robotics or something on a screen. Nolan Arbaugh is able to play video games. He's able to communicate to a certain extent. He's able to do things that he was able to do before, but the abilities that he had lost since 2016 when he became paralyzed. So that's Neuralink, that's a brain chip, and that's Nolan Arbaugh, just at the beginning of this year, who agreed to have that chip embedded. And we're seeing some success with that. In fact, he can even do some narrow tasks beyond what regular people can do, regular quote unquote, people who are not paralyzed. So a New Scientist article that I referenced in this episode, there is, that author of that article went up against Nolan Arbaugh in this web grid game, and Nolan actually got a faster or better score than the person that was not paralyzed. So it obviously raises the question from a science fiction perspective: is this going to be a technology that continues to improve, not just to get paralyzed people some of their functionality back, which is a great use case, but perhaps everyday people who are not even paralyzed will start to submit themselves to be, guinea pigs, if you will, to get these brain implants implanted, and for the purpose of maybe augmenting, their brains in some capacity. Maybe you're getting better memory, maybe you're increasing your processing speed. In other words, the brain chips right now are a one-way communication. They read the data, right? The electrical signals from the brain to do what they need to do, convert that to mechanical motion. But you can imagine going the other way to upload memories, change the perceptions in the brain, maybe increase the processing power in some narrow sense, and so forth. So it raises a lot of ethical and moral questions, but also just, envisioning a scientific type future that you usually only see in science fiction. Now let's think about how this story kind of plays out. Back in 1998, you had Johnny Ray, who was a construction worker. He was paralyzed. And this was really the first invasive BCI, brain-computer interface, that was done. So they went below the skull, on the surface of the brain, just a few electrodes, and Johnny Ray was able to do some rudimentary kind of actions. So a bit of restoration of his original abilities, but pretty rudimentary, pretty basic. And really since 98, what researchers have found is that this is a much more difficult task than one might think. More to the point, they realize that a few electrodes aren't really going to cut it. And the reason is because the usual neuroscientist way of thinking of things is that, the tasks that we do emanate from the brain from specific regions. So you have like the motor cortex. So if I go to move my arm and I want to extend that out, or maybe kind of reach for a cup and bring it to my mouth, the idea would be that there must be a cluster of neurons within a specific region of the brain that is responsible for that specific motion. But as researchers are finding out, this is not really the case. It's not so much that there are specific regions in the brain. In fact, it seems to be an orchestra or a group or a collection of neurons from different regions of the brain that get called upon to do any specific task. So if I go to reach for that glass of water, it's not just the reach for glass water region of the brain neurons that are being called upon. There are neurons from all over the brain, from different regions that maybe the neurons that we thought were responsible for lifting your leg or walking upstairs or listening to music, those are getting called upon too. It's a much more delocalized, non-region specific collection of neurons in great number that are allowing the human brain to enact the motions like playing video games or lifting a glass of water or climbing stairs, things like this. And so this has been the trend in research, is a few electrodes aren't going to cut it. It's very, we're dealing with complex signals, a ton of data. You can't just embed the electrode in a specific region of the brain. The big engineering hurdle here is attempting to decode very complex signals from the human brain, because this is a complex thing. The human brain itself is arguably the most complex phenomenon that we know of. Complex being has a lot of pieces and has a lot of connections. And the signals, the electrical signals that are trying to be decoded by these researchers and engineers are themselves quite complex. You're trying to discriminate between the different signals, so you know when it means reach for the glass of water, when it means play the web grid video game, when it means climb a set of stairs. It's not easy to discriminate between them. Again, these are, could be thousands, millions, if not billions of neurons being called upon in a group across different regions of the brain, highly convoluted and intricate signals to allow the human body to enact what it enacts. And so researchers are essentially trying to get more and more sophisticated with their sensors. They want more electrodes, and to get more kind of global information about the brain as a whole. And so you take a look at, Richard Norman, professor of University of Utah, who had the so-called Utah array in the late 90s. He was originally doing this to stimulate the visual cortex, but a lot of other researchers, organizations like BrainGate and that, kind of realized that this is probably a better way to go for brain-computer interfacing. In other words, not just a few electrodes, probably hundreds of electrodes. And actually, if you look at Neuralink, you're at over 3,000 electrodes. It's this trend to continue to increase the number of electrodes because, again, we're dealing with highly convoluted, intricate signals that are coming from the human brain. A few electrodes aren't going to cut it, and you cannot just target a specific region of the brain. This is a global, delocalized thing, highly complex. We got to get more electrodes into these chips. And that's the trend with brain-computer interface technology, like Neuralink, like BrainGate, like these different organizations who do this stuff, trying to get more electrodes packed into a very small chip that is lightweight. You've got the engineering hurdles related to biocompatibility chemistries. You've got to make sure the data can just be streamed. Obviously, they got to be lightweight. There's that risk of infection. You don't want to have to replace these things all the time. There's all of that kind of biocompatibility stuff. But arguably, the biggest engineering hurdle is just decoding these signals to begin with. More electrodes. And now what you're finding is deep learning is actually being used to help decode the signals themselves. And so if you think about deep learning, these are highly complex models. They're able to pick up on patterns in ways that, simplistic engineering can't do, right? Deep learning is used for facial recognition, for speech recognition. They're behind the chat GPTs. These large language models that we use to do truly human stuff in an engineering way. You have to turn to something like deep learning because deep learning is itself complex. And so this is just an extension of that same narrative we've seen this last couple decades, is that if you want to read and decode these signals, these electrical signals from the human brain, and discriminate between them so you can tell when someone thinks something, what action to turn that into, you're going to have to use something that is itself complex. In other words, more electrodes, more intricacy, and deep learning, which is truly complex. Even 3,000 electrodes is not exactly a complex thing, but it's complicated. But true complexity comes by when we talk about something like a deep learning model, because it has billions of parameters, and it does what it does, akin to how the human brain does what it does, which is to produce its outputs via emergence. Okay, so you've got that story in the brain-computer interface kind of domain of increasing sophistication, increasing intricacy, more electrodes, deep learning. You have your reading tool that you use to read and decode the messages from the human brain has to itself be pretty complex. And so that's the science I want to talk about in this episode now, because I'm arguing that what you're really seeing here is complexity matching. When you have a complex entity like the human brain that gives off signals the way it does, you're not going to be able to decode those signals in a simple fashion. You're going to have your reading instrument be itself quite complex. Complexity matching complexity. And that's what deep learning is. Deep learning model, it's not surprising that would be used, because it is arguably the most complex thing humans have actually been able to come up with. I mean, we have stock markets, and we have electrical grids and cities, things that emerge and that show signs of genuine complexity. Deep learning is an example of kind of a deliberate engineering that reaches levels of complexity that are rarely seen anywhere else, if anywhere else. Again, defining complexity as the number of pieces and the number of interactions being extremely high. Deep learning models have billions of parameters. So let's talk about complexity matching, just the science behind that, and why I'm arguing that that's actually what we're seeing here in brain-computer interface technology with companies like Neuralink. So that the interaction between complex systems is best understood in terms of information. And that may or may not sound surprising, but usually if you take kind of the physics chemistry approach, you think about systems that interact in terms of energy, right? You have kind of these energy landscapes. You might have like a high energy and a lower energy entity, and they come together and they try to kind of establish an equilibrium between them so their energies kind of balance out. But it's actually more appropriate in complex systems to think in terms of information and the sharing of information, if you will, between those entities, and almost a kind of information equilibrium that ends up getting established. In other words, if you think about, well, in this example, the human brain and something like a device that is trying to read it, there has to be some type of informational exchange between them. And in nature, that informational exchange happens between two complex things, not a complex thing and a simple thing, a complex thing and a complex thing. I mean, when we interact as humans, these are two or more people getting together. These are two or more complex, brains interacting and sharing information. And so that's what we see in nature. We see complex entities sharing information to do what they do. That's how they interact. Now, if you think about how to kind of mathematically define something as complex, as opposed to just saying, well, it's something with a lot of pieces and a lot of interactions, one way you can do that is to show that it follows a power law distribution. So in other words, if you go to measure, let's say, the frequency at which something vibrates, or maybe the type of light it's giving off, the motions it goes through, it doesn't really matter, just something that it's doing. You could say what you notice is that it seems to concentrate what it does in a very kind of narrow region of values. And then there's kind of a long tail distribution where it does things with all those other higher values, but not as frequently. In other words, if you were to draw a plot of when it was doing what it does, you would find that plot is all kind of squished to one end in a very narrow range of values. And then you'd have, sometimes it occurs with all these other values, and that would be that long tail. You can see these things in like Pareto distributions. Sometimes you could call them fat tail distributions. But we usually say, in terms of complex systems, is this is a power law distribution, okay? This happens in many, many complex phenomena, if not all of them. It's kind of a signature or hallmark of something being complex. Now, what you can do is you can actually think of two complex things interacting in terms of those power law distributions. The way you would do that is just say, okay, here's one complex thing, maybe it's the human brain. Here's another complex thing, maybe it's the deep learning model. And then you say they both have these power law distributions, these kind of signature fingerprints that say they are complex. And because that power law distribution is something that can be expressed as a mathematical expression, they have an exponent in there. We can call that the power law exponent, if you will. If those exponents have a similar or same value, then they seem to be in communication with one another, is a way to think about it. In other words, you're not just looking at two random complex things, you're looking at two complex things that are kind of talking to each other or have something similar, almost a type of synchronization between them. Now, there's a dynamic version of this as well, and some research will show that instead of just looking at the power law distribution exponents between these two complex things, you can take a look at how they're moving in space, if you will. They're kind of jittering around, they're shaking. And it turns out that every once in a while, one complex thing will have shook itself into one configuration. This other complex thing will have shook itself into a configuration that is amenable to communication. In other words, these things are kind of flexing and moving as complex things do in nature. And every once in a while, they seem to kind of resonate with each other. They're in a kind of synchronicity, if you will. And so it's the same idea that you've got this power law distribution, but you end up looking at that distribution in terms of how these things are moving, as opposed to looking at it for some other reason. So we don't need to get into too much technical detail. But anyways, now we've got this kind of synchronization that tends to occur between complex things. And that, it turns out, is when there seems to be kind of a maximum information exchange between them. And that's what you want when you're talking about complex entities in communication, they have to have this information sharing, and that information sharing happens between complex things when they're kind of moving a certain way in synchronization, if that makes sense. You've got kind of non-chaotic and chaotic versions of this. We don't need to get into all that. You can imagine the brain and the heart in a human body, right? The brain is a complex thing. The heart is a complex thing. These things have to be in some form of communication. So imagine there was a synchronization between the human brain and the heart, and that would only happen if you had, let's say, the exponents of their power law distributions in a similar region, which is really just kind of a mathematical way of saying the brain is doing something from an activity standpoint and the heart is doing something from an activity standpoint, right? The dynamics of them. And every once in a while, or continuously maybe in the terms of brain-heart synchronization, they're kind of moving or doing something in a way where they have kind of a maximum information transfer between them. And that sounds pretty abstract. It might sound a little bit odd. I don't mean the human brain is actually moving. I mean like it's processing, right? The heart is doing something maybe with its beats. But there is a synchronization between them because there has to be some kind of informational exchange between the human brain and the heart. Okay, so now let's think about what that means for brain-computer interfaces, right? Again, just a quick recap. Neuralink recipients like Nolan Arbaugh, they have these chips embedded, right? We originally saw that in '98 with Johnny Ray. And then we got things like the Utah array, which has 100 electrodes. People keep adding more and more electrodes, right? The Neuralink now has over 3,000 electrodes. Now we're using deep learning. What we're doing to read the signals from the brain is getting more and more complex. So we know deep learning has signs of true complexity. And if you think about it, you can take a deep learning model and you can actually find that power law distribution that I was talking about that you see in any complex entity, which means deep learning is itself genuinely complex. So for example, you could take a look at the weights and activations, basically the parameters that are used in the model of the neural network, and you'll find that they follow a power law distribution, especially for the later stages in training. You can also take a look at the learning dynamics, right? Remember I talked about the human brain is doing something dynamically, the heart is doing something dynamically. Well, think about this in terms of a deep learning model. The learning dynamics will show that only a few key features will tend to contribute disproportionately to the model's performance. It's the same thing I was saying before. You get this power law distribution where you got a bunch of things happening in a narrow range of values, then you kind of have a sparsity in the rest of the values. Well, you see that in deep learning as well, these deep learning models, where only a few features contribute disproportionately to the model's performance. You see kind of a power law scaling in, you can take a look at the fact that only a few artificial neurons in these deep learning models become highly activated. There's neural scaling laws where, certain performance metrics like accuracy, if you look at how they scale with model and data size, that seems to happen according to a power law. We don't need to get too technical here, but the take-home message is that just as you can take a look at anything in nature that is complex and typically see this hallmark signature, this fingerprint identity that says, yes, I am complex, which is this power law distribution, you can see that in deep learning models as well. Okay? And so deep learning should be expected to do complexity matching with something like the human brain. Again, complexity matching means you take one complex thing in nature, maybe it's the heart, you take another complex thing, maybe it's the human brain, something else. And if those are going to be into communication with each other, it's because the exponents of their power law distribution seem to have a same value, which physically just means they're both doing something the way complex things do things, such that you have good information transfer between them. Okay? And so let's go back to that brain-computer interface. If you want to have a brain chip, do we have the story of more and more electrodes, more and more intricacy? Why do we have the story of using truly complex models like deep learning to decode the signals from the brain? Well, I argue it's because of this complexity matching. You need something complex to read and decode something complex. There has to be this information communication between them. They have to have a type of synchronization. And so I think, and I argue, that you're going to continue to see the use of deep learning and the decoding of brainwaves. And you're going to obviously see more and more electrodes. You're going to continue to see a complexity matching in order to get the thoughts of an individual decoded into mechanical motion. And maybe that will help us restore functionality to paralyzed individuals. And perhaps one day, as per science fiction, it will lead to things like what we see in The Matrix. Remember Trinity in the movie The Matrix, where she was able to just upload piloting skills for a helicopter, or the main character Neo, where he was able to upload martial arts skills so that he could defend himself better. Maybe that's not so much science fiction 10, 20, 30 years from now, as we continue to do complexity matching and get better matching and information exchange between these brain chips and thought, just merely thinking things. Maybe we can upload memories, change perceptions, maybe we can increase processing speed. I don't know where it all goes. I think it would be more of the narrow sense, meaning for narrow tasks, like with Mr. Arbaugh, right? Nolan Arbaugh was able to beat somebody, but it was in, WebGrid, this very kind of simple game. The way we tend to define skills in today's economy is in a very narrow sense. So maybe for certain narrow tasks, people might opt to have a brain chip embedded in the brain because for that narrow task, they will be better. But for truly kind of genuine human skills that we evolved for over millions of years of hominid evolution, I'm skeptical that a brain chip could do better. But I guess time will only tell. Okay? So kind of take-home message here is when you're doing science on complex things, you're probably going to have to match that with something that is complex itself when it comes to measuring or reading it. That should be expected. That's not really surprising when you have a good understanding of complexity science. And so that's really all I wanted to say. So just a really quick recap. Earlier this year, Neuralink, Elon Musk's company, they make these brain chips, and they're supposed to be embedded in the brain so that they can help paralyzed individuals recapture some of their motion, right? Their motor skills. And Nolan Arbaugh volunteered to be that recipient, and he's doing pretty well so far. He is able to play video games. He's able to communicate to some extent. There's other individuals that have, a lot of companies are jumping onto this beyond Neuralink. You've got people who can just think or imagine of playing a piano, and they can play a simple 10-key piano. Mary had a little lamb type stuff, but not moving anything, just literally thinking. So we're getting technology that can actually read thoughts now. And again, the trend is more intricacy, more electrodes, and more to the point, deep learning, right? Tapping into true complexity. And I argue it's because you have to do complexity matching in order to read and decode something from something that is truly complex. Okay, that's it for this episode. I hope you found that interesting. Until the next one, take care.